Welcome back. A grand plan to rescue the sinking economies. That's what Sarkozy has proposed, as he acknowledges that we cannot continue along the same lines because the same problems will trigger the same disasters. And hence, he has proposed that banks working with state money should not be able to work with tax havens. Also, all financial institutions should be covered by financial regulation. Remuneration packages for traders in financial markets should be calculated and organised to encourage responsible behaviour and not excessive risk-taking. He also proposed that international accounting rules should be adapted to enable banks to survive the financial crisis. The international monetary system should be rethought to find a path between fixed and free-floating exchange rates among major currencies. And finally, the rest of the world financing the US deficit should have a say in the global financial systems. Well, welcome back to our guests. They are, of course, Eric Bergloff in London, Professor Ian Begg, also in London, and Mohan Guruswamy in Delhi. It does seem that the Bretton Woods agreements of 1944 to regulate international monetary and financial orders have been thrown out of the window. So, Ian Begg, are such proposals made by Sarkozy in a roadmap universally acceptable, or do you think there'll be controversy in home governments?
Well, there'll be considerable controversy about certain elements of the package that he's talking about. In particular, the state ownership of banks is something that several of the countries which have rescued their banks regard as temporary. And once that unfolds, which could be as soon as a couple of years, if we take the example of Sweden in the early 1990s, once that unfolds, you'd expect them to return to more typical banking behaviour. So what is critical to me in all of this is the way in which regulation and prudential supervision of banks is reformed. And that's where I would think the most important effort has to be made to change things.
Would you agree with that, Eric Bergloff?
Yes, I think that's right. And the problem with these proposals is that it's based on a sort of a financial system that I don't think it's going to be the financial system that we will see long term. And as Professor Begg said before, I think we need to think of the United States as being a key player. And at the moment, given the political situation in the United States, it will be very difficult for the United States to take a lead on anything like this.
Of your understanding of the European Union, do you think that they can all speak with one voice? Because on certain occasions, with certain topics, they have been quite fractured.
Well, I think what we saw here in the bailout packages or the solutions to the financial crisis that were offered sort of were based on solutions between member states and not using the EU institutions themselves, like the European Commission. And they have no authority on the financial issues. So it's been very difficult, I think, to speak with one voice on these issues. But again, I think there is a need for a discussion, and there is probably, it's not a bad idea to try to have a summit on the issue. I'm a bit worried, though, that we are very much in the middle of a crisis, and these kind of discussions may distract, as important as they are, they may distract us from what is really very important now. These proposals in Europe are still have to be implemented and played out. I think there are many question marks, and one important question mark is how it will affect the countries in Eastern Europe, because as much as we think it's good to support the banks in Western Europe and the banks in Western Europe that are active in Eastern Europe, there is a concern that they will impose rules on these banks in terms of how much they can invest in Eastern Europe, and that could be problematic for those countries.
Well, of course, as European leaders head to Beijing, Mohan Guruswamy, do you think that India, as yet it hasn't said it will attend those meetings at the end of the week, but do you think it will attend? And if so, perhaps lay some of the ground rules that it wants to work from?
I think India will attend, but India will not put any money into American banks. These are two separate issues. I think there is a short-term crisis which has to be dealt with immediately, and that is to bail the American and some European banks out. I don't think we're going to put any money into that, because any money into the US system right now is putting money into an unregulated, out-of-control system. The United States has no norms on lending to sectors, and it's a free-for-all out there, and I don't see us risking our money there. We are taking part in discussions for a new international architecture. India will certainly do that. And when that new architecture is in place, then India will play a part in it by, putting money if required and do whatever is required to make it work.
Of course, no decision is going to be made by any of the main players until the US election sometime after November the 4th. Ian Begg, if this summit does happen, Europe really is waiting to see what sort of administration takes hold of the White House, takes control of the White House. If Bush is sidelined at the moment to a certain extent, how will that impact or influence the way China and India proceed over the next few weeks?
Well, everybody's waiting to see what happens in the US, but I don't think that stops an extensive, what should we call it, brainstorming going on to think about new ways of dealing with the financial problems. There are many topics that need to be sorted out and new ideas that need to be floated about. What is the precise form of regulation that should take place? Should we be thinking in terms of a supranational financial regulator, which could be somewhere in between the Bank for International Settlements and the IMF? Should we have a pan-European prudential supervision? That's something that is going to be rather difficult for the Europeans to agree amongst themselves, because one fundamental point about Europe is there's no such thing as a European taxpayer. There are only national taxpayers in Europe. So that when you asked Eric Berghoff earlier about bailouts in Europe, bailouts have to happen member state by member state, because it's ultimately the taxpayers of individual member states who carry the cost of it. And we should be rather cautious about saying there's a European solution, because Europe is not integrated. It's not a federation in the way the US is. That's a significant difference between the two situations.
Well, of course, as we've seen over this past few weeks, and certainly as banks have collapsed and national governments in Europe and now America have actually stepped in, Eric Berghoff, there was and has been some resistance to the nationalisation of financial institutions, and very vocal in the United States. Do we expect that that voice to be heard much more loudly, perhaps in Europe as time goes by now, or until after an American election?
I think we will see nationalizations in Europe as well. I think this will be necessary in some countries and for some institutions. I think this is a temporary solution, even though, having said that, in Sweden, when they did this, it took a long time to get rid of those shareholdings. Even today, one of the largest banks have a remaining shareholding from this time. So, it's not an easy solution, but it can work, and it has worked quite well in Sweden. This bank that has state ownership has behaved as a private bank, and I think it's been quite successful in what it's doing.
But of course the focus again has always been the fact that banks have not been regulated, or that their regulations have been sidelined. Part of that perhaps is down to President Bill Clinton and Congress Republicans in November 1999 proposing the Financial Services Modernization Act, which really swept away many of the regulations and self-checks that the financial system had in the United States. It's not an issue and a problem that they had in India, is it, Mr. Gurusamy?
No, we are a little bit over-regulated. But you see, the central issue here is the United States has been living well beyond its means for many years. And you had an IMF which should have cautioned it. But the IMF just didn't play its role. The United States kept sucking up all the surpluses from the rest of the world, and it's now the world has become dependent on America, living beyond its means. So we are in a real bind here. I think the IMF too has a big role to play. Well, and if the United States is in control of these institutions, then very little will happen.
Well, we shall see certainly what President Sarkozy has to say when he goes to China. But Ian Begg, can I just ask you for your comments on perhaps this last question as well, is that the world was always very comfortable with the dollar after the Bretton Woods Agreement, after the Second World War, and now the dollar seems to be very vulnerable at the moment. Is there a possibility that there will be a new world currency that will take over from the dollar, perhaps the Chinese or the Indian rupee, perhaps?
Well, it's certainly not the Indian rupee or the Chinese renminbi, not in the foreseeable future of, say, 2 decades. Plus, I would point out to you that the dollar has been rising while this crisis has been unfolding rather than falling. So I think there's still plenty of support for the dollar. I would expect, though, that the euro as a firm currency would take over a bigger share of international reserves, but still take a long time to come up with to parity with the dollar.
Well, Eric Begg, do you agree with that comment? Do you think the euro might be the currency of the future?
No, I think that, as Professor Begg was saying, this is something that will be a coexistence, and the dollar will continue to dominate for the foreseeable future, but the euro will play a more and more important role. And there will be other currencies that will matter also. I think currencies that have economies that are different. Even maybe the Russian ruble will play a role in the future.
Well, we shall see what happens. That is it for this edition of Inside Story. I'd like to thank my guests in London, Eric Bergloff and Professor Ian Begg, and in Delhi, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you for watching us here on Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks for your time. Bye for now.